Thank you everybody again for joining us. We're live on Facebook now as well as on Zoom for the people joining us live. Today's talk is by Ayn Rand Center UK academic advisor Nikos Sotirakopoulos, who's also a lecturer, senior lecturer at York St. John, director of ARI Europe, and has a bunch of other titles I'm sure that he hasn't told me about yet. And he will be talking today about environmentalism, the hidden history and philosophy. So, well, I don't know what the hidden history and philosophy is. I'm eager to find out. So without further ado, Nikos.
Hi, thanks, Raj. Thanks everyone for attending. And by the way, I haven't got any other titles. So today we're going to take a walk to the wild side, as the song says. We're going to cover some aspects of the history and the philosophy of the environmental movement that most people don't know much about. And we're doing this for two reasons. The one reason is because it's interesting, and also it tells us a lot about the culture we're living, and you'll see why I mentioned it. And the second is a question which is open, and I haven't got the answer, and I want to find the answer with you. And the question is, are these very radical parts of the environmental movement we will discuss, are they the logical conclusion of environmentalism, or are they, and how to put it, and something which is not representative of environmentalism? So it's an outlier. And hopefully in the Q&A, we're going to discuss this issue. So we are back, let's travel back to somewhere around 1980. And imagine a group of guys taking a hike to the Mexican desert. Obviously, these guys are time rich. They have time in their hand. They are children of the 1960s, that they grew up during that, in that culture. And now in the early 80s, they find themselves in the deserts. And between a lot of booze and maybe some drugs, they come up with the idea and with a battle cry. And the battle cry is Earth first. And this battle cry becomes the beginning of one of the most notorious radical environmental movements of the previous decades, Earth first with an exclamation mark. And what gave rise to Earth first in the 80s was the idea that up to that point, environmentalism has become too mainstream and too institutionalized. So it's very interesting that today we say that, oh, environmentalism has become part of the elites, environmentalism has become part of the mainstream. But in a way, this has been the case for some time now. So take, for example, the 1970s. Earth Day, I think the 1972 Earth Day, is sanctioned by the US government. Or you have the Club of Rome, a very prestigious elite think tank talking about the limits to growth. So environmentalism has become part of the elites, of the political elites narrative. And this is annoying for us because we say these are bad ideas and these ideas are now engulfed by the establishment, but this is also annoying for radical environmentalists. And they're saying, where is the flame? Where is the radical part of the movement if basically we agree with Nixon or if we agree with established think tanks? So this group of friends form Earth First, and their idea was that we need to rekindle our connection with nature. So radical environmentalism at that time has very little to do with what we have in mind today. What we have in mind today is the urban hippie or hipster holding his or her latte and being, you know, a university grad student or something like that. This has very little to do with what was the image of the radical environmentalist in the States in the 80s. So Earth First, and specifically its founder, Dave Foreman, had a very, what we'd call redneck identity. So the idea was that we want to conserve nature. So back then it wasn't anti-capitalism, it was protect nature and protect the vast amounts of environment in the United States and landscapes that has been up to that point untouched by human beings. So it has a very special American, it's a very special American expression. And that's why the first actions of Earth First is the so-called Round River Rendezvous. And I will read you from their blurb for their first meeting. That was the equivalent of a meetup, but in nature. So you would go, you would retreat in nature, and then you would, in a way, think about the relationship between human and nature. And their blurb said, to reinvigorate, enthuse, inspire, bring passion, humor, and fervency of purpose back into the cause, to forge friendships, cooperation, and alliances throughout the West, to get drunk together, spark a few romances, and haul at the moon. Now, this is something you never see today in Extinction Rebellion, the idea to get drunk and spark a few romances, because that goes against the various safe space policies of modern social movements. So once they go beyond the meetings in the mountains, what is the main trademark of Earth First? Is direct action. So the idea is, up to that point, environmentalism is mostly we go and lobby the politicians. Now the idea is action speaks louder than words. And this was something that was very popular in the 60s. Now the objectivist will already here notice the mentality. The mentality is, we've been thinking too much, but now we need to go to action. And this, what we call anti-conceptual mentality, is very present in radical environmentalism. So what is the trademark of Earth First? It's so-called monkey wrenching. So the Earth First, one of the original ideas for the group, came from a novel of an American novelist called Edward Abbey. And the novel was the Monkey Wrench Gang. This is a group of friends who try to stop a construction work, and they do various kinds of sabotage to stop this. And this gave the idea for Earth First to do the same. And that's how we came to the idea of eco-tage, which comes from eco and sabotage. So they would do mostly two things. The one is they would go and put sugar in the cans of construction vehicles, which means the vehicle would be unable to move. And the other notorious technique of Earth First was tree spiking. So remember, for Earth First, we need to protect nature from human intervention, any part of nature. So the idea is we need to protect the trees. And that's close to that period where you get the notion of the tree hugger, which were people who would tie themselves on trees to stop the cutting of trees. But Earth First did not do tree hugging, they did tree spiking. What is tree spiking? You take a spike and you spike it deep into a tree. When the lumberjack, the logger, goes with the chainsaw, they cannot see the spike, but the moment the chainsaw touches the spike, the chainsaw is destroyed. So the idea was tree spiking would put a lot of cost to the loggers, and they wouldn't cut trees. Now, at some point, as you can guess, this caused accidents. There was one case where a chainsaw touched a spike, which were not put properly, and the chainsaw almost exploded to a poor logger's face and disfigured him. Now, officially, this was not done by Earth First, but that was the point where it became clear that tree spiking was dangerous even for the health of loggers. So that was Earth First. So a group having as its core, again, this idea of conservation and of direct action. Now, what happened at the end to the group? There was a big tension between the, quote, rednecks, conservative conservationists like Foreman, and the new urban leftists. So at some point, Foreman, the hippies took over and Foreman left. And you could say, what happened to Foreman since he formed a group with such bad ideas and practices? We assume he was a pariah in society, right? Wrong is the answer. He was actually on the board of Sierra Club. Do you know Sierra Club? It's one of the most prestigious and mainstream environmental organizations, I think the biggest in the world, in the United States. And he was expelled because at some point, his views on immigration were too radical for Sierra Club. And here we get to something very interesting. What is the ideology of a group that says Earth first? Its ideology and its philosophy cannot be anything like the philosophies that we see around in the left, in the right. It's a philosophy which is called Deep Ecology. And this was a movement that started in the 1960s and the 1970s and influenced not only Earth First, but some of the movements we'll see today. And Deep Ecology says something very simple. It says, philosophy up to this point has done a big mistake. And this mistake is that it has got at its center humans. All philosophies, Marxism, libertarianism, all sorts of philosophies have the same flaw. At the center of the philosophy is the human. But, says Deep Ecology, the human is nothing special. Nature has inherent value. So guess what the Deep Ecologists have missed? They've missed Ayn Rand's very famous way to put it. Something is of value to whom and for what? Deep Ecology says this is an invalid question, although probably they've never even heard it. So their idea is nature has value in itself, irrespective of whether it's useful to humans or not. Now, try and think, where would that lead them? So for example, it leads them again to the idea of anthropocentrism. So human beings have nothing special. So human beings have the same moral status as a cat, a cockroach, maybe even a germ. I mean, if everything on Earth has the same inherent, has its own inherent value, we shouldn't have any specific value. But it goes a step further. Not only we haven't got inherent value, but what is our difference from cockroaches, they say? We have already had a big impact on nature. And what does this mean? It means that this impact needs to be reduced. And what is the number one manifestation of this impact? The fact that there are too many of us around. So Deep Ecology brings on the table the issue of overpopulation. And that's my personal view. Overpopulation is quite often the battle cry of the misanthropist, of the anti-humanist. So overpopulation has a history going back to the 19th century and actually to Malthus. But interestingly, the first mention saying that there are too many of us on planet Earth goes back to the Roman Empire. So whether the population of the Earth was 100 million or 500 million or 1 billion, there were always some people who said, there's too many human beings here and something needs to be done. Of course, this becomes big in the 19th century with Malthus, and one of the few good things that Marx did was to discredit Malthus, and they had a very interesting back and forth. And then on the 20th century with Paul Ehrlich. Now, how does the idea of overpopulation express itself in practice? So the issue is that who are the main centers of overpopulation? And see here not only the misanthropy, but the racism. It's highly unlikely that these people would say the problem of overpopulation is myself or my family or my community. It's always people out there. So if you see even prestigious people like, for example, people of our member of, like David Attenborough, for example, they often talk about immigration. And why does immigration annoy them? Because it means more people from these places, that there are too many of them that we don't want, are going to come here. So deep ecologists and radical environmentalists, many of them were against immigration. And Dave Foreman was fanatically against immigration. And this is what took him away from the board of Sierra Club. Not the fact that he created a group that had as its trademark eco-sabotage. Not that he wrote a pamphlet about how to do eco-sabotage. Of course, he said, oh, this is only, I'm writing this only for information purposes. I'm not calling anyone to do these things. By the way, his pamphlet of how to do eco-sabotage, again, you'd think it's banned, it's in a blacklist. Actually, you can find it in a university library, or at least it's one of the libraries of my previous universities. Because again, acts of violence, first of all, it's not even act of violence, because if it's against property, they call it non-violent action. And not only them, the whole literature on academia agrees. That's non-violent action. I didn't do anything. I just threw some sugar or on your car, and your car is there. Or, as we'll see later, I just bombed your ski resorts and you have 12 millions of damage. But that's non-violent because that's property. I didn't harm any human being. So always a co-traveler of the radical environmentalists is this misanthropy, is this view of human beings as mouths to be fed. So if you don't see human beings as something special, every new baby that is born in China, in India, in Africa, for them, it's not a mind or two hands that can create. For them, it's a mouth to be fed. What a pathetic view of human beings, by the way. And this leads to some monstrous points of view. So around 1980s, we have the spread of HIV. And for a normal human being, this is something horrendous. But if you're a deep ecologist of the kind of some of the people we see, this is good news. And why is that? Because for them, HIV would be, quote, a necessary solution, as an activist of Earth First said, to the population problem. So the Nazis talk about the Jewish question and the Jewish problem. These people talk about the population problem. Now, think again about how often you hear from prestigious people this idea that human beings are a virus on Earth. Now, imagine if someone said a specific race is a virus on Earth. We'd say this person belongs to the trash can of history. But if you say it about all human beings irrespectively, it's like, yeah, thumbs up. So someone in Earth First with the nickname Misanthropy, put it together, misanthropy, said, quote, to paraphrase Voltaire, if the AIDS epidemic didn't exist, radical environmentalists would have to invent one. And this created a lot of tension within the group and within people around the group. Because they said, come on, maybe we're taking it a bit too far. Yeah, sure, there are too many of us, but come on, let's not take it to extremes. So one thing that this view that says that human beings are nothing special is misanthropy. Another characteristic is, as you can guess, the abandonment of reason. Because, again, let's do some rantsplaining to the deep ecologist. What makes us human and special? The use of our mind. If we're not special, and if humans is the same as everything else, then the mind is invalid. So that's why you see in these movements, this thriving of irrationality and of weird, obscure ideas around spirituality. So what they would do in these meetups in the mountain quite often is these weird rituals and these weird rituals is these weird games or role playing, but not sexual role playing, but you would go outside of the circle and then you'd come back as a specific animal and things like that. And there was a deeper meaning for that. So listen what an activist said, quote, "Later in the day, we separated and spent an hour or so alone with the intention of coming back into the circle, representing another being. I was a butterfly. I spoke of metamorphosis. I spoke about how I could be seen as a teacher to humans if they would only listen." And you could say, why this crazy stuff? Why these rituals? And another activist explains, ritual is the basis of pagan spirituality. Now, I go away from the quote. Again, in the absence of reason, you need something to make sense of the world. And pagan spirituality gives these people this frame to see the world. So when Rand talks about the return of the primitive, and by the way, Rand wrote The Return of the Primitive 2 decades before Earth First. Now, this is the primitive at its purest. Going back to the quote, ritual unlocks the rigidity of the rational observing mind and requires our physical participation. It is how we connect and pay respect to our place in the world, and it connects us to the biotic community that sustains us. And another activist, when asked about what is wrong and what are you against, he says, quote, "We have rationalized ideas, rationality, and a limited kind of, quote, practicality. And we have regarded the ritual of other cultures as at best frivolous curiosities. The results are all too evident." Apparently the results that are too evident is the industrial civilization and all the achievements of capitalism. And another group of thought that was close to these ideas is the ideas of primitivism. And the primitivists are the darkest of the dark corners of environmentalism. So the primitivists say the problem is with civilization itself, with technology itself. Now, depending on what kind of primitivist you are, you might want to bring it back to the feudal society, to the agricultural society, or for many of them, even beyond the agricultural society, because then we were one with nature. Now, if you ask me which is the most, in its potentiality, genocidal philosophy in the world, I would say primitivism. Because imagine what would be the number of deaths if we give up technology like that. So one primitivist, when asked, what is it ethical to eat while we're in civilization, his answer was only roadkill. Because this is already something which is killed, no one is gonna eat it, as opposed to a lion eating something. So it's ethical to eat roadkill, but only roadkill. Now, to be very fair, this is a very, 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 very tiny minority, not only of the environmental movement, but of the radical environmental movement. But again, I want you to think how far. So if you say humans are nothing special and humans have no right to intervene in nature, which is the idea of Deep Ecology, how far are we from there to primitivism? Because we know, how do we survive? By changing nature, by intervening to nature. That is our identity. This is in our nature. To use their terms, nature wants us to intervene in nature because that's how we survive. But the deep ecologists don't get that. Anyway, as it usually happens, one radical group suddenly becomes not too radical and something even more radical needs to come around. So after the Earth First, we had a different kind of radical environmentalism, which again, I have to say, it was very small, and it was the so-called eco-terrorism of groups like Earth Liberation Front and Animal Liberation Front. So in the 70s and 80s, the idea of a liberation front was that there was a persecuted or there was a community that was under some form of occupation, and the Liberation Front would stand up in arms. So you have, for example, Palestinian Liberation Front. In various places you had Liberation Front. Now the Earth Liberation Front, or let's start with the Animal Liberation Front, protects supposedly the animals, which are the persecuted, not minority, because they're not minority, they're the persecuted group, and you save them from humans. So what they did was mostly attacks on laboratories, freeing animals, and blowing up laboratories in universities and in clinics. And we're talking about damage of millions. And sometimes, see how stupid they are, sometimes they would release a population of minks, for example, in nature, in an environment that they were not accustomed to. So either they would eat everything else, and then the ecological balance of that place would be disturbed, or they would die within minutes from other predators. So in a way, you could say they were also a bit playing God. And the Earth Liberation Front would do sabotage, such as torch SUVs. So till some years ago, you could find stickers by Earth First saying, "My SUV was torched by Earth Liberation Front." Now notice something, these groups, as opposed to Earth First, they don't have specific members. So let's say me and Razi, we agree, so they're decentralized groups. Let's say me and Razi agree with the principles of Earth Liberation Front, we can blow up something, and we say this was done in the name of Earth Liberation Front. So they don't have headquarters, they don't have offices. They have supporters and networks that support them, but they are ghost groups. And Earth Liberation Front at some point bombed a ski resort, and the cost of the damage was $12 million. And I think at that point, this was before 9/11, don't quote me on that, I think it was the costliest terrorist attack in American soil, but I'm not 100% sure. So at some point, they were the #1 domestic terrorist threat, according to the authorities. But this, throughout the years, weakened. And the last group or persona I want to refer to is probably someone that most of you might have heard, Captain Paul Watson, not to be confused with Paul Joseph Watson on Twitter. So Paul Watson had the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society in the 80s and from there. So what was that? He was captain in a ship, a bit like Ragnar Daneskjold, but a Ragnar Daneskjold with a different agenda. So his agenda was he would sabotage and attack whaling ships. So he was against whaling. Now, he has sunk, according to different sources, and he hasn't said no, up to 12 ships. So he would go when they were in the port and no one was there, damage it, and the whale ship would sink. But even when, before the whale ship would sink, he would attack them in open ocean. So either they would get between the ship and the whale, which you could say is a way to protect the whale and from the harpoon, or they would throw stink bombs, not real bombs, like bombs, but that they stink. Or most usually what they do is they would throw some bombs that would make the surface on the ship very, very slippery. So the sailors, if you see when you do whale hunting, you have to be very agile and you have to stand because you need to turn the harpoon. So you can't do this, so you can't effectively attack the whale. What was his rewards for doing all that by polite society? He got a good contract with various major TV networks for his TV series Whale Wars. Now, of course, now he's not singing ships anymore, so he's become a bit. So everything is okay, no hard feelings there. So this is the history of some of these movements. Now, if you want more information, you can get in touch, and I can give you some sources, some books on either primitivism or radical environmentalism. You won't believe what you're reading. It's crazy stuff. Now, I had to go within 20 minutes very, very quickly through all that. But if you want any more information about any of that, get in touch with email or something and I'll give you bibliography. And now, again, the final thought. Are these completely nuts and crazy outliers? And maybe, for example, now what we see Extinction Rebellion is something completely different, kind, non-violent? Or is it that these people, there's something in their ideas and actions, which is the true face of environmentalism? Again, as I said, to be fair, this is a tiny, tiny, tiny minority that took on these actions. And quite often they were condemned by mainstream environmentalism. So the question is this just a historical thing from the past, or there's something more to that? Thank you.
Thanks, Nikos. That's an excellent talk, excellent enough that I'm gonna, before I even get to questions, encourage everybody here as soon as it's over to share it. It'll be on our Facebook page where it already is actually live, and we'll have it on YouTube and the podcast platforms within a couple of days. Now, since there are no hands raised, I will ask the first of my several questions, and then maybe we'll get to some more. So are there any lessons that you think the objectivist movement can learn, at least in terms of popularizing the message, maybe not, copying specific tactics and stuff, but anything in how it went from, very small, fringe philosophical movement to something that is today the consensus, at least it's, watered down version is consensus.
So I'm not sure about so for example, compared to these groups, Greenpeace is mainstream. So for example, Captain Paul Watson left Greenpeace because he was disillusioned with Greenpeace because it's so mainstream. But if you see, specifically in the 90s, the campaigns of Greenpeace, they are brilliant core campaigns. I remember one in the 90s that they had paid adverts that were paying for 5 minutes in Greek TV. They had a song by Enigma. The song was called The Return to Innocence. And they were showing their various heroic actions standing in front of the whales. And as a kid, I was blown away. I was like, I can't wait to grow up and become one of these people, because these people are heroes. These people take action. So one lesson would be that people respond to people who take their ideas seriously. People respond when they see you tying yourself somewhere because they say you're committed. So what's the lesson for us, or maybe not for us? The lesson is, for example, dear conservatives, that when your government is doing something which infringes our liberties, you don't go on Twitter and say, well, maybe that went a bit too far. You denounce them making a lot of noise, and you make your principles obvious, clear to everyone. That's what the environmentalists did. They did not compromise at any point, or those who compromised, there were others who put them on the spot. And again, I'm not talking about the eco-terrorists, I'm talking about people such as Greenpeace. So I'm saying this very, very consciously. I don't think there has been in the history a more effective campaign, or it's probably the top 5 effective campaigns, than the anti-whaling campaign of Greenpeace in the 80s. So anyone who wants to run campaigns, they should take, I don't know what lessons are to be learned there, but they should learn them. What does our friends Alex Epstein and Don Godkin says? Change the frame. What did they do? Historically, the idea is that human is small and the whale is the monster. Moby Dick, Jonas, they flipped this. In their view, the whale is a giant and the human is the enemy. And again, I still love whales. So, but specifically in the 80s and the 90s, this was the first thing that really, really made me see that this is a campaign that I want to be part of. So yeah, there are things to there are things to learn. I think we have two hands raised.
Yeah, so Mary Ellen, you are unmuted.
Okay. Do you know if these people were influenced at all or have any roots in the eugenicist movement that was, and you're nodding, in this country, like the 20s and 30s? I know Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist, though I hesitate to say that because her good outweighed that. And Hitler was influenced by the eugenicist movement. And I'm not sure when the Club of Rome started, but they were around for a long time. So that's my question.
That's a brilliant question. Because it's so important, I don't want to give you an answer if I'm not sure. I can definitely tell you that there were many in the progressive movement that were influenced by these ideas. But specifically on the environmentalists of that time, I think they were mostly influenced by racist ideas by default. It's not that they've read this, it's just their logical conclusion of where their beliefs led them. So, for example, if human beings are a plague on Earth, where is it that more human beings are born? Africa. Ah, they are the enemy. So I wouldn't be surprised if someone told me that some of the more conservative elements of Earth First had also these views. But I don't know. What I do know is that in action, they expressed very racist, at least with today's standards, definitely racist, and horrendous views that was not necessarily their conscious choice, but it is where their ideas lead them. That's why we say ideas have consequences. If you see human beings as the plague, it's a matter of time till you become a racist, a misanthrope, and you endorse policies and campaigns that could lead to the demise of millions. And again, see how, I don't want to name names, very influential and well-respected people in this country, for example, in the UK, who were against immigration from Syria. Or think about how many of the overpopulation zealots said that we should not help Africa, or if we help, it should be with strings attached. And these strings is mostly birth control. Now, I could definitely get, in a different context, an argument that says you don't have a moral duty to help Africa. But to say that you don't want to help Africa because there are too many of them, I found this horrendous. So there is an argument to say I want aid to be private, or you don't have a moral duty, or you only help if you want. But to frame it in this monstrous thing that these people are breeding like rabbits, basically, I find this very, very bad. And again, it's unbelievable to me how these people get away with it. I can't understand how Sierra Club, for example, could have this facet of respect. Or how, like, imagine someone who is blowing up cars in 5 years having his own reality TV show in very respected platforms. But with Captain Paul Watson, yeah, it's okay. And again, it used to be a myth that he had sunk ships, but it looks like he doesn't deny it. So that's the culture we live in. But sorry, I can't answer your question, but I haven't got this. I don't know if they were actually directly influenced by eugenicists. Sorry, one pitch here. A guy with whom I don't agree in many other things, Jeffrey Tucker, has done a very good job on how the racism and the eugenicist thought in the early 19th and 20th century has influenced the progressive movement in the States. So if you Google Jeffrey Tucker, racism, progressive movement, he's done some good work. Again, I don't like him in some other parts of his work. That part of his work is very good and interesting.
Bob.
Thanks, Stephanie. I just read the comment. Yeah.
I don't think that merely because there were people presented as heroes that this has gone over. I think the real thing that has put it over is that it is a package deal. Environmentalism packages everybody wants clean air and clean water with all of the evils that it has. So it's like the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. Everybody who's good and goes along with it thinks that it's opposed to police brutality, but in fact, its essence is opposed to capitalism. And so I think the same thing is at play here. And I think that Alex does a very good job of tearing it apart, tearing the package into its pieces. Let's look at the fundamentals. You know, and as Ayn Rand says, when you the most fundamental principle, if you're true to that, that's the one that's going to win. And the principle here is it human life flourishing, or is it intrinsic value of non-human things? So,
okay, that's a very good point. And let's also talk about what were the merits of the movement, because in the 60s and in the 70s, the environmental destruction in the United States was at a level that today most people cannot comprehend it. So it was way worse. So if you go, for example, and see the days where the pollution, the really bad pollution in New York or Detroit, how many days per year it was so bad that if you had a problem, it was difficult to go out. You'd see it was many days of the year. There were times that some rivers were so polluted that they would literally catch fire. And I think there is a song by, what's her name? The one who sings Because the Night Belonged to Lovers, Patti Smith. I think there's a song of her that that refers to that. But anyway, so that's what Bob rightly says. There's a package deal. There is a very legitimate part in being concerned about the effects of environmental destruction in human lives. And there was a time when many of these campaigns had some points that were legitimate. But when it comes to radical environmentalism, not only they did not focus on that. So here's something that needs to become very, very clear. These groups that I mentioned actually considered it a problem that we focused on these issues. So they said, oh, when the river catches on fire or when that factory pollutes your water, you people are suddenly upset. But what about the destruction that we do to the forest or to the nature or to the animals? So the radical environmentalists and the radical part of the environmental movement, they did not accept that this is a legitimate point. And they said that actually this is a sign of degeneracy because it shows how alienated you are from nature. You only care when you get poisoned, but what about the rest of the destruction? So yes, so if we talk about environmentalism in general, it's this package deal, as you said, but also see how close it plays to various, let's say, primordial myths. The idea that humanity has gone too far. How often do we hear that? Ancient Greek, the myth of Icarus. Icarus flies close to the sun, he drops. The environmentalists, you will hear this all the time. We've gone too far. We've gone too far. So they play with this. They play with the beauty of the landscape. So that's why I said Earth Firsters were very different than the latte drinking hipsters of today's environmental activism. They would literally people who would spend their time in the landscapes and they would appreciate the beauty. And let's be frank, you go to nature, you go to the mountains, I go to the Greek mountains, the beauty is overwhelming. And it's very easy then to take this in the wrong context and it says, this is a value irrespective of me. As if I disappeared, there would be no beauty. Because it would be beauty to whom? A guy from the left who has done a very, very good criticism. Here's a nice landscape with, with both. So a guy from the left who has done a very good critique of these sorts of environmentalism is a guy called Mari Bookchin. And Bookchin said a very interesting point. He said, if the last wolf would eat the last caribou, no one would care. The wolf wouldn't think, oh, that's the last caribou. So if I eat this, then there's going to be no carbon. No. If we disappear, beauty disappears. The idea of beauty, the concept of beauty is a very human thing, right? So you cannot even say if we disappear, it's going to be good for the earth. What does good mean? By what standards? Good for whom? So even in their basic premise, they are wrong. Let's go to, before we go to Marilyn, I see I've missed comments. Without cars, will there be roadkill? Yeah, well, don't look for consistency in the primitivist thought. Paul Watson, yeah, that's the guy. Who is responsible for teaching these ideas in schools? This reminds me another story. I don't know if it's now the time to tell the story, but it's such a funny story that I'll tell it even if it's a bit out of context. So at some point, I think it was in the 80s or in the 90s, environmental education was big in schools. So someone was asked to write a pamphlet, a child's book, and distribute it to schools. And this guy, he had a good fantasy. He walked around, he gathered some stories, and he created the story of Chief Seattle. So I don't know if you've seen this, but when I was growing up, it was a very big thing. Supposedly, it was this chief, Native American chief, and he gave this inspiring talk to the white man. And he said, all your money mean nothing to our land. So while I was growing up, Chief Seattle was so big that every good leftist would have a poster in the room with some quote from Chief Seattle. Now, what's the interesting thing with the Chief Seattle story? It's completely made up. And how do we know? The guy who made it up told us that it's made up. He said, I just made this story to give a nice story to kids. But then because the story got a thing of its own, then the people who distribute the story and create books, films, I think even Al Gore at some point quotes Chief Seattle. So there's this book about Chief Seattle, and the guy calls and says, guys, Chief Seattle is an urban myth. And he says, the publisher says, how do you know? He says, because I created that myth. So turns out there was a Chief Seattle, and the only speech he gave to the whites was a speech where they make a deal that you keep this land, we keep this land. And because Chief Seattle spoke a different language from the interpreter, the Chief Seattle talked to the interpreter, then the interpreter interpreted in another dialect to another interpreter, and then they spoke to the white guy. But because, again, this idea that, and this is also quasi-racist, right? That, these native people, they have this beautiful relationship with nature. See Pocahontas, for example. What is that? It's essentializing Native Americans. They're all the same. They're all the same. They're all in such good relationship with nature. Of course, the environmental record of some of these tribes is atrocious, for example, on how they would hunt buffaloes, but that's another discussion. So yes, environmental education was such a big thing that it created all these kind of, all these stories like the Chief Seattle one. Sorry, we've got Marilyn and Helen.
Yeah. By the way, you've offended latte drinkers everywhere, and I think I'm not sure if I think Mary Ellen is from Seattle, if I'm not mistaken, right? Which is the home of lattes. So
actually, let me see if I find the link with the Chief Seattle story, because I'll put it on the chat, or you know what? I'll put it as a comment on Facebook, because it's so funny, and it's actually funnier than what I said. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No offense if you drink latte. I think I took this from Spiked. I just liked it. The latte. Anyway. Okay.
Yeah. I'm in Everett, Washington, which is very near Seattle, and Seattle is going batshit crazy. So, but what I was going to say is it's a beautiful area, and we've had a huge problem with smoke and dangerous, hazardous air quality for quite a long time because of very bad forest management. We've had fires all up and down the West Coast, actually nowhere near Seattle, but the smoke has traveled. And I assumed that people would wake up and say, we've got to manage the forest fires better. And I should have seen it coming, because I'm in a lot of Toastmaster groups, and I have a lot of contact with leftists, many of whom are very nice people. And I do it on purpose because, you know, they respect me, and sometimes I can get a word in. Everybody thinks it's global warming. There's just like, and they're in tears. It's like a religious thing. And it's hard to know what to say, because, you know, telling people you just don't make any progress by being rude. So it's been very discouraging.
And another, you mentioned the religious elements. Another link with religion is this almost original sin. By the mere fact that you're alive, yes, you contribute to the problem. And think of another religious element. Think of this idea that you pay for your carbon footprint. What did the Catholics do some centuries ago? They would write you a paper that says you are forgiven if you pay some money. Equally, you can do a carbon offshoot of, how's it called? Anyway, the specific, sorry?
Carbon offset, right?
Carbon offset, yes, yes. And as Marilyn says, indulgences, yes. So this was the case. And again, yes, we see that we have still a lot of important problems related to the environment. Forests are one. In many parts of the world, pollution is one. But my point is that by putting it into this frame, into the frame that nature has value in itself, irrespective of human beings, it's impossible to solve these problems. So if you're, and even I would say, even with conservation. So I am a big proponent of conserving, for example, whales, because I love seeing them. I think they're very beautiful. There's a much, Raz is not a friend of whales, apparently. But see, for example, what is the record in places where you have, let's say, property rights on land compared to places you don't have property rights in land. Now, sea is way more difficult and complicated, but what I'm saying is that the agenda of someone who believes in individual rights, who believes in property rights, is not necessarily against the agenda of someone who wants to protect some beautiful parts of the environment for human enjoyment. Because then you answer to the question of value to whom. So you could say this landscape is of value to me, therefore I can come together with some people, form, I don't know, a trust, whatever, buy the area, or so don't fall to this pseudo dilemma which says, oh, so you want the factories to pollute the water, and you want the forest burn, and you want skyscrapers in all the. No, you can pursue your values using the tools of individual rights and of what it means to be a free human being. Helen has her hand raised.
Yeah, just to point out, I'm with you on the whales if you want to, conserve them in your bathtub. But if somebody wants to hunt whales because they, like it as food, yeah, unless the whale is your property, you have no right to, or on your property, you have no right to say that they can't do it. Helen.
Yeah, I have a couple of things for Mary-Aline about her comment about the forests. The first one is, how come the fires stop at the Canadian or the Mexican border? No, they don't cross. So if the California forest or the American West Coast is on fire, why the Canadian or the California or the Mexican forests are not on fire? And that's one of the arguments against that. And the second one is, if it's a question of higher temperatures, the Amazon forest or anything around the equator should be on fire, which is, it's nonsense.
So Helen, can I ask you something on that? Because I've heard this as well. So what is the explanation then that you give? That is it arson attacks?
Well, no, not necessarily. It could, usually the forest gets lighted by thunder. They say it's a tinderbox because they have not cleared the brush, and then of course there is the problem that the residential areas are not allowed to be protected. So it is insanity the way this whole thing has been handled. But and then yes, there is arson as well. They have.
I'll go to Marilyn in a second. Thank you for bringing this up. So in Greece, we have the same problem with fires. And up to a big point, it's dry leaves, but quite often it's arson, but quite often it can be anything. It can be an accident. So even you have a glass, for example, if it's 40 degrees Celsius and there's leaves behind the glass, this can start the fire. And 2 years ago, there were 40 people died from a fire because it went around the community area. It was a horrendous tragedy. So yeah, it's really bad. So Marilyn, do you want to?
If you don't mind, my question was, I think this whole environmentalist thing is a complete contradiction, because you just have to point to any ruthless environmentalist. Look, you are so concerned about the environment and everything, and you want to preserve forests and deserts and this and the other, but then you promote those awful, monstrous windmills and blanket the desert with these absurd solar panels. And isn't that destroying the environment? So you are absurd. Don't give me that BS, because you are just showing with your actions that you could not care less about the environment.
So someone more suspicious than myself here would say that mostly they're A, anti-progress, and B, anti-capitalist. But I don't want to psychologize people. So let's make something clear here. The power of ideology is so strong that it's very easy. So obviously I was a leftist, and now I was also an environmentalist, though not for a very long time. But it so makes sense when you hear every authority, from the Pope, the President of the United States, the royal family, every celebrity, when everyone is telling you this, it's very easy to be afraid. Think about COVID. Think about how much we know now, how much more we know now since March. And yet many people now, they're more afraid because, and even myself, I find myself at times more nervous now than in April. Because when you hear all day, scaremongering, fear-mongering, it's very easy at some point, specifically if you're not always alert, if you're not, the ignition here is not on the on mode all the time, it's very easy to internalize this. So although there are many in the environmental movement who are consciously anti-progress and anti-capitalism, I would say you need to have rock-solid character to be able to see through the BS to what are the legitimate claims and what are the non-legitimate claims. So thank you. I think your comment was very, very important. So Marilyn, do you have any comment on the fires based on what Helen said?
Yeah. Well, I don't think Helen and I disagree.
Oh yeah, you don't disagree, but because you know more, because it's in the area.
Well, the Mexicans and the Canadians manage their forests. The environmentalists say that forests are sacred and we don't touch them. I mean, it goes back to the spiking and the loggers and the spotted owl, all that garbage, where they really did everything they could to stop the logging in Washington and Oregon, and I assume California too, so that, you know, forests naturally, trees die, they fall over, there's debris on the ground, And if you don't clear it out, it becomes a tinderbox. And that has happened. Their forests are just ready to burst into flame. So that's a big part of it. Also, if forest land is held privately, managing it includes cutting trees. And a tremendous percentage of the forest land in this country is now government owned, and they don't cut or manage anything because it's sacred. So that's a big part of it. Alex Epstein has some really great information on the fires. And also California is really pushing going totally green with energy, which is causing blackouts and just massive problems, and has also, and I don't understand all the ins and outs of how that has contributed to the fires, but Alex has some good information on that, which is on my list of things to do, to read, because I think, you know, the people at the top are evil, but there's really good people in Seattle, in the Seattle area, who truly believe, and again, it's very much like a religion, that they need to not live so extravagantly. They need to just stop enjoying ordinary things because they need to contribute to the cause of saving the planet. And it's very sad.
Again, this idea about how we are, see again the religious undertones. Greed is one of the sins, right? One of the cardinal sins. So environmentalism quite often has the banner of science, but quite often you see in its philosophy, you look behind it and you see also the banner of religion. Helen has a point, and then I want to ask Razi something, because there's an interesting discussion in the topics.
Following Marilene's comment, in this last week's Power Hour for Alex Epstein, he has an interview with Patrick Moore, and he's a forester initially, or by education, and he explains very, very clearly the whole issue about forest management and why the fires are happening, and how to prevent it. And basically,
is this Patrick Moore, who was one of the founders of Greenpeace and then left?
Yes. Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Exactly. Right.
So question to Razi. So there's this discussion about how to protect whales.
Yeah,
and
I really
private...
hope you're not going to ask me how the oceans can be privatized.
No, I'm not going to ask you this. It's a genuine question. I'm not putting you on the spot. What about the activism that Greenpeace did with the whales, which is they stood between the whale and the ship? So do they violate anyone's rights? Now, granted, they put themselves in danger, and you could also say they put the ship in danger. But could we say that this is, maybe we can say it's immoral, whatever, but would you say they have a right to do that? I'm thinking out loud. So Sea Shepherd Society would throw stink bombs and slippery soap bombs, or even sink ships while they're in port. So clearly violate rights. What if you put your Zodiac, your boat, between the whale and the harpoon?
I don't know. I guess the solution to that is some sort of, you know, property rights, even in the ocean, you know.
Yeah, to be honest, I've read in my libertarian days the Walter Block stuff on privatizing the oceans. The point is, how do you make a claim to that? How do you, anyway, it's difficult.
I would guess it's some sort of, you know, equivalent of homesteading, but in the ocean.
Yeah, how do you homestead the ocean? I'm sure there's some way you could say I homestead this part. We don't have Joseph today to ask about how he envisions it with the seasteading projects.
No, but we have people who have been studying objectivism for longer than both of us combined. And if any of you have an answer for that, that's better than the non-answers that we've given, Helen, you're unmuted.
Well, it's a very tricky situation. What's the name of the organization? Sierra Club. They went in front of the ship, but they didn't use violence. They didn't attack the ship. They didn't throw bombs or anything like that. They were just blocking the action. Now, you could say they don't have the right to do that because the ship is, but there was no aggression or destruction of property or anything like that. So to some extent, their protest was valid legally because there was no use of violence. But, you know, that's
again, I don't know all the rules, so I wouldn't be surprised if there's some meaningful rule that says in the open sea you can't do maneuvers or. But yeah, it's a difficult discussion. But irrespective again of what we think about it morally, legally, there's no question it was one of the most successful campaigns in history. And it shows the importance of framing. The moment Greenpeace, I don't know who was the genius who came up with this reframing, but the moment they reframed whale weak, human strong, the moment they came with this reframing, the campaign wrote itself. All you needed then was, of course, the image, the heroic stuff, the music. Also, there's another very good, very successful YouTube video with Greenpeace and the song "You Only Get What You Give" from the New Radicals. Again, it's very, very successful in conveying the message. I wish we had the equivalent of finding way to frame something in this light for a good cause like our cause. So we have Bob who wants to do something. Let me go 1 second in the comments and I'm with you, Bob, in a second. Privatizing the ocean is a legal/technological, not a philosophical moral issue. I agree with Mario-Hélène, but still it's a difficult one. Morality and practicality can intersect, says Antoine. Though if some part of reality cannot be dealt with thanks to a certain philosophy, then the philosophy has to be questioned. Yeah, but the fact that we don't have the technology to do that, I don't think it poses any question to the philosophy. Stephanie says it's an interesting legal question. How would this be handled even when there are objective legal framework? How does objectives provide the foundation for approaching the question? I think the foundation for approaching the question is there. I think here is more of an issue of application. So let's see if Bob can shed some light to all that.
I doubt it. For one thing, until the government is focusing on protecting individual rights, it will be impossible to resolve this issue. Now, if in fact the government does focus on individual rights, then what happens is when two people's attempt to control some property comes in conflict, then the law has to define what in fact are the property rights. But there's no sense in doing that until the law is ready to worry about that. When it comes, we're not going to be able to say what the situation is. The free market has marvelous ways of acting, which we can't predict ahead of time. But without it being free, there's no way to solve it.
And in the open ocean, this becomes even more, it's almost a wild frontier if you think about it, because there is no state law applying there. It's international law, which is, I mean, think about what happens with Greece and Turkey. And our dispute about the barriers in the sea and how much of the so it's difficult. When we talk about sea, it's even more difficult to not to come up with principles, but to apply them than it is in the land.
But there have been precedents with water within a nation and even across borders. So it's not hopeless.
It's not hopeless, but it's more difficult.
it is hopeless.
So I'm just checking again the comments. An interesting legal question. The point of doing it is to have the objective answer. I find fun to figure out what the answer ought to be. So Razi, let's find a legal expert in the objectivist universe, and maybe we can have a future event on what are the rights on sea and whether if you can privatize the ocean or whatever.
Yeah, and I've been inspired by the story of this movement's rapid growth. So and the forest meetups that led to it. So Bob's current background is actually where we're moving all future Ayn Rand meetups. That's I hope you join us from this Wednesday onwards. Any last questions or comments? Now is the time to raise your hand.
I actually worked for the Forest Service some 50 years ago, almost. And the job that I did was to survey logging roads and what the Forest Service would grant logging permits to private companies in exchange for the private companies building roads to those areas so that those roads could be used to fight the fires. I have not kept up with anybody since those 50 years, so I don't know whether that's done or not. And I haven't yet heard Alex's Power Hour, so I'd be curious to know whether or not anybody still builds fire roads to prevent fires.
And to link it with the discussion on privatizing the ocean, some of the first private roads, literally private roads, were roads related to having access to forest or roads in the wilderness. So the usual question, who's going to build the roads? We have examples of private roads in nature. So we have two more hands. Razi, who was first? Helen and then Stephanie.
Well, according to Patrick Moore, and in that interview with Alex, he says the access roads have actually been neglected or completely destroyed on purpose. So the firefighters and people that are going to protect the property are not able even to come around. And the other thing that he also mentions is that sometimes the fires should, and probably I'm preaching to the choir, Bob, but that the fire should be allowed to continue, not suppress them, because that doesn't solve the problem. They need to clean up the forest, and they don't let it happen. And
I've heard this from forest conservationists also in Greece. It's a controversial view, but it's a view. I mean, it's out there from science. It's not something completely, outside of the pale. Stephanie.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much. Great talk. Really enjoyed this. I'd like us to have like a follow-up to go out and just gather evidence about what the state is. I've seen some of the irrationality in Twitter encounters with people. So, it's like to see where we stand, what can we do, how can we find a path forward, like to take the kind of action and reframing. And I'm beginning to come up with an answer to the question that I myself raised about how to figure it out. And we might be referring to the way military works, where a country has a certain amount of space that it has in the ocean. And so either you have to go beyond that space to just be first come, first serve, right? You can't be within a space that's too close for a military reason. And then it's international waters. It's who can govern that? Who should govern it? Obviously, it's like something in the future. You're basically writing for centuries into the future. It's not going to happen in our lifetimes that we have a legal framework that's rational. on even one country, never mind the whole world. So it's really just for having the answers and being the, the Aristotles and the Basquiats of our time.
And actually, now that you mention it, if you think what is the ideology of some of the super rich, I wouldn't be surprised if Bill Gates is part of the ocean. The whales would flourish there because no one would be allowed to hunt. If you take into account the ecological consciousness of Silicon Valley, I mean, environmentalists should be advocating for the privatizations of ocean. It's not going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, but when you have a ban on hunting any particular thing, you send the ecosystem into a different kind of disarray. It's really what works is when you want certain animals and you take care of them, or you raise them to harvest their products, their milk or their fur or whatever it is, then you actually end up having more of them rather than by banning all use. That keeps them endangered rather than plentiful, right?
Well, our governments believe that
cows, do we?
Our governments believe that they can control and central plan how we deal with the virus. So I'm not surprised that some people think they can figure out how to micromanage the ecological stability somewhere. Anyway, thank you very much. You were a very good audience with good questions. So thank you. Razi, parting words.
Yeah, thanks again to Nikos and to everybody who's joined us. And yeah, a massive thanks to everybody who is a member. This is, all of this costs money. So membership is massively appreciated. And if you can afford to do so, we encourage you to join the membership program. And of course, thanks to the Prometheus Foundation, which sponsors almost everything we do. Yeah, we are back in person on Wednesday. If you're in London, it's not going to be in the forest. That was a joke. And we're back next Monday online. So next Monday's discussion is rethinking education, and the speakers are Lisa Van Dam and Joanna Williams. Nikos will be chairing that. I know he's a massive fan of both, so that's going to be an interesting discussion. And actually, so let me thank the Facebook audience, and then we're going to go off Facebook Live, and I'll continue.
Bye, Facebook.
And by the way, Facebook people, if you want to see, how the sausage is made and everything, you need to sign up to the London Ayn Rand meetup, and then you can see what happens after we go off the live stream.